Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
The events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger.
When the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after liftoff on January 28, 1986, the world assumed all 7 crew members died instantly. That was the story NASA let the public believe. But buried in the Rogers Commission report, in technical appendices almost no one read, investigators documented evidence from the ocean floor that tells a completely different story.
This morning, the discovery undersea of a large section of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which exploded more than 3 decades ago.
The crew cabin did not explode. It separated from the shuttle in one piece, rose to 65,000 feet, then fell for nearly 3 minutes before hitting the Atlantic at over 200 miles per hour. Here's what changes everything. When forensic teams examined the wreckage, they found emergency air packs manually activated by human hands and cockpit switches deliberately repositioned by a pilot still trying to restore power. There was no final log entry. No recording survived the fall, but the crew left behind something more chilling than words. Proof they were alive, aware, and fighting all the way down. By the end of this video, you'll understand what that evidence revealed. The lie you've probably already heard now. Before we get into what investigators actually found, we need to clear something up. Because if you've ever searched for the Challenger crew's final moments online, you've almost certainly come across a so-called secret transcript. It claims to be a leaked NASA recording of the crew screaming, crying, and saying goodbye to their families during the fall. It reads like a horror movie script. And get this, the whole thing is completely fabricated. It was invented by the Weekly World News, a tabloid newspaper famous for making up stories, and published in February 1991. Snopes debunked it. Aerospace historians debunked it. NASA debunked it. The crew did not wear personal voice recorders. The cabin intercom lost power the instant the shuttle broke apart. There is no secret tape. There never was. But here's the deal. That fake transcript spread so widely precisely because NASA left a vacuum. They buried the real findings in clinical language and technical reports that the public never saw. And the real evidence? It didn't need fabrication to be devastating. It is, in many ways, worse than what that tabloid invented, because it's true. And it starts with what happened in the seconds before everything went wrong. 73 seconds, January 28th, 1986. Cape Canaveral, Florida. The coldest launch morning in shuttle history. Temperatures had plunged to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, with readings as low as 18 degrees in some areas near the pad. Icicles clung to the service structures. Here's the catch. The night before, engineer Roger Boisjoli at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, had fought desperately to stop this launch. He had been warning for months that the rubber O-ring seals between rocket booster segments could fail in cold weather. His words, written in an internal memo 6 months earlier, could not have been more explicit. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. Boisjoli and his colleagues recommended against launching below 53 degrees. NASA pushed back hard. Morton Thiokol management, under intense pressure from NASA officials who questioned their data and challenged their conclusions, overruled their own engineers. Alan McDonald, director of the booster rocket project, refused to sign the launch recommendation. His bosses signed it instead. Historians have noted it was the first time in shuttle history that NASA had launched after receiving an explicit no-go recommendation from a major contractor. And the sharp questioning of that no-go recommendation stood in stark contrast to the immediate, unquestioning acceptance when the recommendation was changed to a go. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off. Millions of school children were watching live from their classrooms because aboard that shuttle was Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from over 11,000 applicants to become the first ordinary citizen in space. Their teachers had wheeled in television sets. Kids were sitting cross-legged on gymnasium floors. Parents had taken the day off to watch. This was supposed to be the launch that brought space into every living room in America. And get this, the crew aboard that shuttle was extraordinary. Mission specialist Ronald McNair, a physicist, had planned to record a saxophone piece in orbit for an album by French musician Jean-Michel Jarre. Mission specialist Judith Resnick was one of the first American women selected for the astronaut program. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was a satellite engineer who had already been bumped from 2 previous missions. Every one of them had fought to be on this flight. The launch looked normal. Commander Dick Scobie confirmed the shuttle's performance. At 68 seconds, he acknowledged the command to increase engine power with 5 calm words. Roger, go at throttle up. 3 seconds later, pilot Michael Smith, a decorated Navy captain who had flown 28 different types of aircraft and logged nearly 5,000 hours of flight time, spoke the last words the cabin intercom ever captured. Just 2 words. Uh-oh. Then every data stream from Challenger went silent. But the story of what happened next was only just beginning. It didn't explode from the ground. It looked like a bomb had gone off. A massive fireball. 2 solid rocket boosters spiraling wildly out of control. News anchors stammering through the words, obviously a major malfunction. But here's what most people still don't understand, even decades later. Challenger did not explode. The failed O-ring allowed hot gases to burn through the booster seal and rupture the external fuel tank. The tank split open. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen ignited into the fireball the world saw on television. But the shuttle itself was ripped apart by aerodynamic forces at Mach 1.92. Nearly twice the speed of sound. It was not a detonation. It was disintegration. Now, this is where it gets dark. When investigators later analyzed tracking photographs and radar data, they identified something emerging from that fireball that nobody expected. The crew cabin, the forward section of the shuttle where all 7 astronauts were strapped into their seats, had separated from the rest of the vehicle as a single, largely intact unit. It was not vaporized. It was not shattered. It came out of that cloud of fire in one piece, and it kept going. If this is the first time you're hearing this, hit subscribe, because what investigators found inside that cabin changes everything about what we thought we knew about this disaster. The longest fall in spaceflight history, after separating from the disintegrating shuttle at about 48,000 feet, the crew cabin continued upward on its own momentum. Trailing cables and wiring harnesses that had ripped loose from the fuselage stabilized it, almost like the tail of a kite, preventing a violent tumble. Within 10 to 20 seconds, the compartment settled into a nose-down attitude. It climbed to roughly 65,000 feet. Then it began to fall. No engine, no control surfaces, no communication with the ground, no way to steer, no way to slow down. Just a sealed compartment carrying 7 people on a ballistic arc through the upper atmosphere toward the Atlantic Ocean. The sky outside the windows, if anyone could see through them, would have been almost black at that altitude. The curvature of the Earth would have been visible. The fall lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. To put that in perspective, that is longer than most people can hold their breath. That is longer than the entire powered flight of Challenger before the breakup. It is an eternity when you are falling. And get this, during that entire time, the cabin was structurally intact. The middeck floor had not buckled. There was no evidence of fire or explosion inside the compartment. Then it hit the ocean at 207 miles per hour. The estimated deceleration on impact exceeded 200 Gs, far beyond what any human body or any structure could withstand. Nothing could survive that. Death on impact was instantaneous and absolute. But the question that haunted every investigator who touched this case was not about the impact. It was about the fall. Were they conscious? Did they know what was happening? Were they aware that they were going to die? And when divers finally reached that wreckage 6 weeks later, they found their answer. The switches, March 7th, 1986. Divers from the USS Preserver located the remains of the crew cabin on the ocean floor, roughly 100 feet deep, about 18 miles off the coast of Cape Canaveral. What they brought back would quietly rewrite the entire narrative of this disaster. Here's the catch. Inside the shattered cockpit, investigators found that several electrical system switches on pilot Michael. Smith's right-hand panel had been moved from their normal launch positions, and these were not ordinary toggle switches. Astronaut Richard Mullane, Smith's colleague, later explained that these switches were protected with lever locks that had to be pulled outward against a spring force before they could be moved. Later, testing confirmed something critical. Neither the aerodynamic forces of the breakup nor the violence of the ocean impact could have shifted those switches. Someone moved them by hand. Michael Smith, in a darkened, powerless cockpit hurtling through the sky, had methodically worked through his emergency checklist, pulling lever locks, repositioning switches, trying to restore electrical power to the flight deck, one by one, systematically, the way he had been trained. That is not the action of a man who is unconscious. That is not the reflex of someone who doesn't know what's happening. That is a pilot doing his job in the worst conditions any pilot has ever faced. Astronaut Jim Bagian, himself a physician, and astronaut Manley Sonny Carter later speculated that penetrations in the cabin's aft bulkhead, created by the violently severed payload bay connections, could have caused a depressurization. But the switch evidence told a story that went beyond engineering speculation. It told a human story, but here's the deal. The switches were only the beginning. Investigators recovered 4 personal egress air packs from the wreckage, PEAPs, emergency breathing devices designed to provide about 6 minutes of air. They cannot activate automatically. A crew member has to physically reach the pack, unlock it, and pull it into position. 3 of the 4 recovered PEAPs had been manually activated. Now, this is where it gets truly heartbreaking. Smith's PEAP was mounted on the back of his seat, in a position he could not reach himself. Someone behind him on the flight deck had leaned forward and activated it for him. Dr. Joseph Kerwin, the former Skylab astronaut and physician who led the forensic analysis of the crew's final moments, confirmed this activation was not caused by the impact or breakup forces. It was a deliberate, conscious human act. Smith's wife later studied the seating positions and concluded it was most likely mission specialist Ellison Onizuka who had reached forward and turned on Smith's air supply. Think about that for a moment. Onizuka, in the middle of the most disorienting, terrifying seconds imaginable, did not freeze. He did not think only of himself. He reached forward and tried to save the man sitting in front of him. And the amount of air remaining in Smith's pack, it was consistent with roughly 2.5 minutes of use, almost exactly the duration of the cabin's fall from the fireball to the ocean. The evidence pointed to one devastating conclusion. At least some of the crew were alive and conscious after the breakup, and they used every second they had. What they experienced, Dr. Joseph. Kerwin spent weeks analyzing every scrap of recovered wreckage, every data point, every piece of physical evidence before delivering his findings to NASA. His report, released July 28, 1986, is one of the most carefully worded documents the agency has ever produced. His conclusion was measured but unmistakable. The cause of death of the Challenger astronauts cannot be positively determined. The forces to which the crew were exposed during orbiter breakup were probably not sufficient to cause death or serious injury. And the crew possibly, but not certainly, lost consciousness in the seconds following orbiter breakup due to in-flight loss of crew module pressure. Here's what that means in plain language. The breakup forces hit about 12 to 20 Gs for a fraction of a second, then drop below 4 Gs within 2 seconds, then free fall within 10. Violent, but survivable. The crew was strapped in. The cabin held. The critical question was whether the cabin kept its pressure. At 48,000 feet, the atmosphere outside cannot sustain consciousness. If the cabin depressurized rapidly, the crew would have blacked out within seconds, even with their air packs, since the PEAPs delivered unpressurized air that couldn't maintain consciousness at that altitude without a sealed cabin. Kerwin found evidence that pointed toward depressurization. The severed connections where the cabin ripped free provided multiple paths for air to escape. Debris embedded between the forward windows suggested a possible breach. Stowed equipment showed damage consistent with rapid pressure loss. But here's the grim truth. 6 weeks in salt water, and the catastrophic violence of a 200-gram impact had destroyed so much evidence that no one could say for certain how fast the cabin lost pressure, or how long the crew remained aware. Every scrap of paper from the wreckage was analyzed. Not a single crew member had written a note. The crew seats and restraint harnesses showed failure patterns, demonstrating that all seats were occupied and all harnesses were locked at the moment of water impact. Commander Scobie's PEAP was the one that had not been activated, and it was in a position that was difficult to reach, suggesting that no one behind him was able to get to it in time. The engineering consensus points to one scenario, and it is devastating. The cabin lost pressure relatively quickly. The crew had enough awareness to activate air packs and attempt switch procedures, actions that took seconds. Then unconsciousness followed as pressure dropped at extreme altitude. No evidence suggests prolonged suffering, no evidence of fire or explosion inside the cabin. But they were aware long enough to act, long enough to reach for each other. And that is the decoded truth that no fabricated transcript could ever capture. What changed forever? The Challenger disaster grounded the shuttle fleet for 32 months. The Rogers Commission, featuring Neil Armstrong, Sally Ride, and physicist Richard Feynman, tore NASA's culture apart. During the televised hearings, Feynman performed one of the most famous demonstrations in science history. He placed a piece of O-ring rubber in a glass of ice water, squeezed it, and released it. The rubber didn't bounce back. It had lost its resilience in the cold. In seconds, he showed the world what killed 7 people. His conclusion echoed through aerospace engineering forever after. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Bois-Joly and McDonald, the 2 men who fought hardest to stop the launch, both paid a price. Morton Theokold demoted them both. Bois-Joly eventually resigned and spent the rest of his life lecturing on engineering ethics until his death in 2012. McDonald was later reinstated under congressional pressure, put in charge of redesigning the very joints that had failed, and co-authored one of the most authoritative accounts of the disaster, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, before his death in 2021. The booster joints were completely redesigned at a cost of $680 million. Crew escape systems were developed, and NASA's safety culture was rebuilt from the ground up. But none of that brought back the 7 people who should never have launched that morning. And none of it fully explained why NASA had worked so hard to keep the crew cabin findings out of the spotlight. The agency fought in court against media requests for photographs of the wreckage. It resisted Freedom of Information Act requests for the audio recordings. When the New York Times sued for access, NASA argued that the written transcripts were complete, that there was nothing additional to be learned from voice inflections or cabin background noise, and that releasing the tapes would invade the crew's privacy and traumatize their families. The court sided with NASA. The families themselves had to navigate unimaginable grief in the public eye. Michael, Smith's wife, Jane, filed a lawsuit against NASA, alleging the agency was negligent in launching despite known risks, and that her husband had lived long enough to understand his fate. The families eventually reached confidential settlements with the government. Most of the details have never been made public, and so the real story remained buried, not in classified files, not behind locked doors, but in plain sight, in technical appendices and forensic reports that almost nobody thought to read. What they left behind. There was no final log entry, no goodbye, no last words beyond a pilot's quiet, "uh-oh," as his instruments began telling a story he could not yet fully comprehend. The intercom lost power at the moment of breakup. Whatever was said after that, if anything was said at all, was lost to the silence of a cabin falling through the upper atmosphere. But there was something else, something more powerful than words. There were switches carefully unlocked and repositioned by a pilot who refused to stop flying a ship that could no longer fly. There was an air pack activated on the back of a colleague's seat by a man who chose, in the worst seconds of his life, to think of someone else first. There were harnesses still locked, seats still occupied, every single crew member at their station when the cabin met the ocean. No one had unbuckled, no one had abandoned their post, no one had given up. They were not passengers. They were not frozen in terror. They were professionals doing their jobs in a situation that had no solution, and they did not stop. The decoded truth of the Challenger's final moments is not found in some leaked tape or government cover-up. It is not hidden in classified files. It is etched into the physical evidence left behind by 7 human beings who, even falling through the sky with no way out and no hope of rescue, refused to give up. And that is the truth that is beyond horrifying, not because of what they suffered, but because of what they tried to do, knowing on some level that it would not be enough, that there was no way out. And they tried anyway. They deserve to be remembered for exactly that. Not as victims, not as symbols of a disaster, as professionals, doing their jobs to the very last second. If this story changed the way you think about the Challenger disaster, subscribe now. We tell the stories that the official record tried to bury, and there are more of them than you think.